Hello, welcome to our next lesson today. So what we'll be looking at first is putting arguments into standard form. So if you remember from the previous video that we saw some arguments put into standard form where things were listed as P1, P2, first premise, second premise, etc. And you saw previous examples of how I had put arguments into standard form. Today we're going to look more formally and more carefully at how to put arguments into standard form. And this can be very helpful in logic and critical thinking. And that's because in order to criticize an argument, it's really important to be able to get clear on the ins and outs of that argument. Right? In order to object to the argument, it's best to have a full understanding of that argument in and of itself. And if you put it in standard form, and you do it correctly, you can see everything about the argument right in front of you in a very clear way, which can help you assess the argument in itself. So what we want to do is we want to put all the statements into declarative sentences and replace all pronouns with nouns. So don't use he or she, but use the actual names, for example, of people when you have to use a person's name in an argument. And this can help eliminate any unclarity that might exist if you have maybe several characters or several actors in an argument, several persons, and you're using he or she. It might not be clear exactly what those pronouns are referring to. And make sure you put all statements into declarative sentences. For example, if there is an implicit statement contained within a question, well then, when you're writing out that implicit statement, write it as a statement, as a declarative statement. Don't write it in its form as being a question when putting an argument into standard form. Second, it will be important to also to insert any unstated premises and any unstated conclusions. Right? That way you can see all the rungs in the ladder that are required for you to be able to reach to the, or someone else, to reach the top of the ladder to attain their or your conclusion. So each argument may have countless unstated premises. However, include only those unstated premises that are immediately relevant to the argument, that are necessary and that are kind of major unstated premises and conclusions. If you really think hard enough in an argument, you can always come up with countless and countless unstated premises. However, only include those that are most major and most relevant to the argument itself. Okay, third, number each premise and precede the number with a P, just like, for example, P1, P2, P3. Also use this C, parentheses, to indicate a conclusion. All right, and we'll be looking at an example shortly of an argument that is in standard form, which can hopefully give you a better picture of these various things that you have to do to put an argument into standard form. Also, place the premises before the conclusion. It's important to try to tell a story. And a story has a beginning, a middle, and the end. In the case for an argument, the end of the story is the conclusion. And the premises are the beginning and the middle, but you want to make sure you have a beginning and then follow that by the middle. So place the premises before the conclusion and make sure they're arranged in a kind of storybook kind of way so that as you're reading down the premises, P1 to P2 to P3, they tell this kind of fluid story in which the reader, someone else, who may not even be familiar with the issue that you are arguing about, can very easily and comprehensively and clearly understand the argument. Also draw a truncated or shortened line between the last premise and the conclusion in order to indicate the word therefore. So that line that's drawn between the last premise and the conclusion means therefore. Also try to arrange the premises in a clear fashion. Remember, try to tell a story, try to arrange the premises such that you are telling a coherent story. There are also maybe different correct ways of putting an argument into standard form. So don't think that there's only one correct way to put an argument in standard form. There are many different ways you can put an argument into standard form. So that's okay. Don't get overly concerned about what's the single proper way to put an argument to standard form. There are various ways of doing so. So let's look at an example of an argument that I put into standard form. And this is a classic argument in the history of philosophy of religion. It's the teleological argument for God's existence. The first premise is this, and notice I have P1, P2, P3, P4, P5, right? Listing the premises. And I'm trying to list these premises in a clear, logically ordered kind of way to tell a nice story that in which the reader can easily tie them together and hopefully will be able to see the conclusion and why the conclusion might be supported by the premises. So the first premise is this: a watch has design, purpose, arrangement, and construction. Now, it could have been the case, for example, that I could have had P1, a watch has design, P2, a watch has purpose, P3, a watch has arrangement. That would be okay to do it that way, but like I said, there are a variety of different ways to put an argument properly into standard form. So what I've done is I've bunched these together here in the first premise. The second premise is this: everything with design requires an intelligent designer. And P3, a watch has a designer. So P1 and P2 support P3, that a watch has designer, because a watch has design, purpose, and arrangement, and something that has those kinds of qualities, as the second premise states, has an intelligent designer. So therefore, a watch has a designer. And then P4, it says analogously. In other words, this argument is an argument by analogy. It's trying to draw an analogy to a watch and how a watch has a designer. Analogously, plants, animals, and nature have design and purpose. They have complex parts. So if you, for example, open up an old pocket watch and looked in the back, you would see many different gears working together in a very complex way. And then you might infer from that a watch has a designer. Well, likewise, plants and animals and nature, when you look at them, and you can even open them up, so to speak, such as through surgery or what have you, you can see that there's a complexity to them. There's a kind of design and purpose, etc. So this argument goes. And then the fifth premise says nature has an intelligent designer. So this is analogous to how, well, if a watch has these certain kinds of qualities, well, then they have a designer. Well, analogously, plants and animals have these kinds of qualities as well, so therefore nature has an intelligent designer. Therefore, conclusion, an intelligent designer exists. And this teleological logical argument is here saying that, well, this intelligent designer is God. All right, and so notice that there's a truncated line between P5 and the conclusion. And that line is to indicate therefore. Right? Therefore, here's the conclusion. And once again, keep in mind that you want to try to arrange the premises in as clear a way as possible so that someone who may not even be familiar with the issue at hand can understand the argument. Right? So let's move on to some concepts here. Linked arguments and sub-arguments. What are linked arguments? Well, linked arguments is when two arguments are linked, or we can say that they are linked, when the conclusion of one argument is used as the premise of another argument. So a notion that's very much tied to linked arguments is sub-arguments. Sub-arguments are arguments that are used to support the premise of the main argument. In other words, if you have a sub-argument, you have a main argument and you have a sub-argument, where the sub-argument is used to support a premise in the main argument. So in other words, the sub-argument and the main argument in a way are linked. And you can even think that the sub-argument is kind of part of the main argument. And so why it's important to know these concepts, and I'm about to state why they are very much linked together even further, is that controversial premises require further support. So you can have an argument, and there could be a premise or maybe even several premises that themselves are controversial and they require further evidence. And those premises themselves in the main argument require themselves premises to support that premise. In other words, you need a linked argument. You need another argument that is linked to the main argument, where the conclusion of the argument is used as the premise of another argument. In other words, you have a sub-argument where the conclusion of the sub-argument is used as a premise of another argument. So if you have a main argument where there is one premise that is controversial, well then you need an argument to support that controversial premise in the main argument. And that other argument is the sub-argument. Hence, in a sense, we have two arguments here that are linked. They are linked arguments. And when you have an argument, linked arguments, and you're putting them together in standard form, place the premises and conclusion of the sub-argument together when putting an argument in standard form. And this goes along with the idea of arranging your premises in a clear way. Right? If you have a sub-argument, well, put the premises and the conclusion of the sub-argument together. And this way the reader can see how the conclusion of the sub-argument is supported by the relevant premises, because they're placed together, where the premises in the sub-argument precede the conclusion in the sub-argument. All right, so this might be a little confusing. Let's go through an example, and hopefully this will make it clearer or even more clear. So let's look at an example case, and you can feel free to pause the video to see if you can put this in standard form yourself. And I actually encourage you to do this. The more exercise and practice you get, the better you can possibly do on the tests. So here we have a passage. Angelina Jolie and Mila Kunis are my favorite actresses. But I think the former is a better actress. In other words, Jolie is a better actress. And the person making this argument is saying Jolie has been in better movies and has displayed supreme acting talents in them. I know this because she is always being nominated for acting awards. So we want to put this argument into standard form. And, well, we have to find the premises and conclusion. And remember from the previous lecture that it could be very helpful for you to first find what the conclusion is. Right? What is everything else in the passage kind of leaning towards or trying to support? Well, here the conclusion is that Angelina Jolie is a better actress than Kunis. So that's the conclusion. Right? We see everything else trying to support that. All right, so we know the conclusion, so now we find the premises. What are the premises that support this conclusion? Well, this person who's making this argument is trying to support their conclusion by saying that Jolie has been in better movies. All right, so we know that's one premise. Here's another one. Jolie has displayed supreme acting talents in them. This is another reason or premise put in favor of the conclusion that Jolie is a better actress than Kunis. However, this premise seems controversial, right? She displays supreme acting talents. Well, how do you know that, right? How do you know that Jolie has displayed supreme acting talents? What's your evidence or reason to believe that that's the case? So what this person does is supports this premise with an argument. Well, she displays supreme acting talents because she is always being nominated for acting awards. So what we have here is a sub-argument. The conclusion in the sub-argument is that Jolie has displayed supreme acting talents. The premise to justify this conclusion in the sub-argument is that she is always being nominated for acting awards. So the conclusion in this sub-argument, that Jolie has displayed supreme acting talents, is itself used as then a premise in the main argument, along with the claim that Jolie has been in better movies, to then try and support the conclusion that Jolie is a better actress. In other words, we have linked arguments here. And this is how I have them up in standard form. So we have the first premise, Jolie has been in better movies than Kunis. We have our conclusion, Jolie is a better actress than Kunis. And then I have the sub-argument in purple. Now, if you were to actually write out this argument in standard form, you don't have to use different colored ink for the sub-argument, but I'm just doing this as a visual aid for you to see clearly what the sub-argument in this overall argument is. And it's this, second premise, Jolie is always being nominated for acting awards, P3, and that supports the conclusion in the sub-argument that Joly has displayed supreme acting talents. Right? So that in and of itself, you can look at it as an argument. It's a sub-argument. Premise: Joly is always being nominated for acting awards. Therefore, Joly has displayed supreme acting talents. We're going to use the conclusion in the sub-argument in P3 along with P1. Joly has been in better movies than Kunis. Those together support the main conclusion in the overall main argument that Joly is a better actress than Kunis. Alright, so let's go through some exercises. Let's put this argument in standard form. This argument is this: if he goes to work, he'll get very sick. But he won't go to work, so I don't think that he'll get sick. Right? How should we put this in standard form? Well, we should find the conclusion first. There's a nice indicator word, so. So that here indicates the conclusion. I don't think that he'll get sick. What are the premises? Well, we can look at the first sentence there, and that is the first premise. If he goes to work, he'll get very sick. Second premise, he won't go to work. Conclusion, therefore, I don't think that he'll get sick. So it looks something like this. Right? This is how it would look like in standard form. Notice P1, P2, C for conclusion, the truncated line between the last premise and the conclusion. Try to order in a very clear, comprehensive fashion. And this is what we have in standard form. Alright, so let's look next at the next one. Put the argument in standard form. Here we have Napoleon lost either at Waterloo or at Austerlitz. There's a statue in honor of his victory at Austerlitz, so he must have won at Waterloo. Find the conclusion first, and that can help you find the premises, because the premises are nothing but those reasons or evidence that counts in favor of the conclusion. So we have the conclusion. We see an indicator word there, so, and given the context of this passage, this so is a good indicator word. The conclusion is that Napoleon must have lost at Waterloo. Right? We're not going to say he must have lost at Waterloo, but we're going to use Napoleon must have lost at Waterloo. We have the conclusion. Now, what's the evidence in the passage that's put forth for it? Well, Napoleon lost either at Waterloo or at Austerlitz. There's a statue of his victory at Austerlitz. Those are the premises. Napoleon lost either at Waterloo or at Austerlitz. There's a statue in honor of his victory at Austerlitz. P1, P2, conclusion, therefore Napoleon lost at Waterloo. Alright, so that concludes our lesson for today, and I will see you tomorrow.